Here's another guy who thinks that consciousness is woo.
So I've got an argument about the nature of you. I'm going to share it just for your consideration. It's got two premises. The first premise is that you are aware of some of your thoughts.
Yes, and that awareness is itself a thought.
And not aware of any material states in your brain.
If the two are the same thing, then to be aware of your thoughts is to be aware of material neurological processes. I think what you mean, though, is that when you think about something, there's nothing about that experience that makes it apparent that it consists ultimately of brain cell activity. However, it does not follow from this fact that subjective experience does not consist of brain cell activity. To infer that it does follow is to commit a compositional fallacy. The elements of conscious experience need not be consciously experienced.
All right, now, in order to see the truth of that, go ahead and just focus on your thoughts, and that will verify the first part of that first premise, that you're aware of some of your thoughts. And then ask yourself whether you're also aware of any of your material states. Now, if you're aware of your material states, presumably you can tell us something about them, just as you can tell us something about which thoughts you're having. You're aware of your thoughts, and that's how you're able to tell us which thoughts you're having. But you're not aware of your material states. So that's the first premise. Does that seem true to you? What do you think about that?
I think it is fallacious to infer that mental states are therefore not comprised of brain cell activity.
All right, well, here's the second premise. If you are aware of your thoughts and not your material states, then those thoughts that you're aware of are not the same as any material states.
I believe that thoughts are really material processes rather than material states, but if this is the case, literally anything I told you about my thoughts would be telling you something about the material processes my brain is carrying out. I wouldn't be able to tell you exactly which brain cells are doing what, but that doesn't mean that my thoughts are not ultimately comprised of brain cell activity.
Now, the second premise is verified just by a basic principle of identity. The principle just says this, that if A is in fact identical to B, they're one and the same thing, then whatever's true of A has got to be true of B, because they're one and the same.
This does not apply when we're talking about a thing's composition. Marble, per se, does not have legs, but this does not mean that a statue with legs cannot be marble. A marble statue is a kind of configuration of marble, just as consciousness is a kind of pattern of material activity.
Right? So if your thoughts that you're aware of just are material states, then by being aware of those thoughts, whatever's true of those thoughts should be true of some material state. Well, here's something that's true of those thoughts, that you're aware of them. But by the first premise, you're not thereby aware of any material states in your brain. And so it follows then that your thoughts, the ones that you're aware of, are not identical to any material states. At least not any in your brain.
If your mental states are essentially material, then to be aware of your thoughts is to be aware of something material. It is to be aware of something your brain is doing. The fact that we can't introspectively perceive our brain activity in terms of brain cell interaction does not mean that it does not have the property of being brain cell interaction. To assume this is to commit a masked man fallacy, which means you are confusing the inability to detect a property with the absence of a property. Johann and Ratz likes to argue that you can't make a masked man fallacy about consciousness because anything that is not accessible to consciousness cannot be part of consciousness. But this is a compositional fallacy. There is no logical reason why consciousness cannot be composed of elements that are not apparent to consciousness.
Now, presumably, if they were identical to a material state, they'd be identical to a material state in your brain. So then it's reasonable to then have the corollary, your thoughts just are not material at all. What do you think about that argument? I mean, is that too simple? What are your objections?
My objections are that it commits a masked man fallacy and a compositional fallacy. Some properties of consciousness are only accessible from a first-person perspective, and some are only accessible from a third-person perspective. The existence of mutually inaccessible perspectives of a phenomenon does not denote the existence of distinct phenomena.
Here's my response to the perspectives objection. My response is that there's something right about the perspectives objection, but it doesn't actually defeat the premises, doesn't defeat the argument that I gave. So what's right about it is that it's possible to have two different perspectives of the same reality and not realize that. Now, Lois is aware of Superman, but she doesn't realize she's aware of Superman because she's only witnessing the properties that she associates with Clark Kent. But notice that in order for there to be two different perspectives in the first place, there has to be two different sets of properties, the ones that she associates with Clark Kent and then the ones that she associates with Superman, and those can't be the same.
It's irrelevant that they can't be the same. The point is that they are two sets of properties held by the same phenomenon. The fact that you can have two sets of properties that can each only be witnessed from its own perspective does not mean that those sets of properties cannot be held by the same thing.
Because otherwise you couldn't get confused and have two different perspectives. Well, similarly, in order to even have two different perspectives about your thoughts, there have to be two different kinds of properties. The material, scientific properties that you can study by looking at the brain, and this other kind of property, what we might call an irreducibly subjective or qualitative property that you witness through direct, immediate awareness of your thoughts.
These two perspectives need not be divided into material and immaterial perspectives. Rather, I think it makes more sense to divide them into the first-person perspective and the third-person perspective. If they are both ultimately brain activity, then they are both material. What does it even mean to say that the first-person perspective is immaterial? If thoughts are not material processes, then what are they? Why did they occur?
And what this shows is that, although so far as the argument goes, it might be that there is a common reality that has these two different kinds of properties, the material and the subjective. The material properties don't provide a complete description of the reality. There's something in addition to reality than the material states of you.
Only if you assume that the first-person properties are immaterial, whatever that even means.
There's something that you have access to, your subjective qualities, and those are very interesting because they can't be accounted for purely in terms of a material description.
Yes, they can. We understand the brain well enough now that we can know how some particular brain states would be subjectively experienced, even if those brain states have never been produced before. We have predictively useful explanations. However, if they are immaterial, how do you account for them? If thoughts are not physical processes, then how do you account for their occurrence? Thanks again for helping me out on Patreon.